Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this discussion here at the ISS on the Vatican's new foreign policy from Russia to Cuba. When Pope Francis assumed his position, of course he did so in an international context that was highly dynamic and fluid from a geopolitical perspective, and that has required the Vatican, as it has required other governments around the world, to think very clearly about what their interests are and what their priorities are and how those should be pursued. And so we're going to be talking about Vatican diplomacy and the new approaches that have been taken. And what we'll do is we'll review the situation with regard to recent developments in Cuba. We'll also go over the terrain with regard to Ukraine, and in between those 2 points I'm sure there'll be scope for discussing a number of other issues as well, such as Syria and other matters. And I think we really are in a position to be able to say that we have two of the best qualified people to address these issues for us. We'll start with Massimo Franco, who is one of Italy's leading political commentators and journalists, but has a strong record in publishing on Vatican affairs. His most recent book being The Vatican According to Pope Francis, which came out in 2014. He's written on the historical relations between the Vatican and the United States. Parallel Empires was the name of that publication. He's also written recently on the notion of the Vatican as the global accused, delving into some of the controversies with which the Vatican has had to grapple in recent years. We're particularly delighted that he's going to be joined by Antonio Mennini, the Apostolic Nuncio to the Court of St. James, a position which he's held since 2010. Mr. Mennini has been in the Vatican diplomatic service for over 30 years, and notably has spent about 8 years or so representing the Vatican in Russia. So without further ado, let me hand over to Massimo to introduce the subject, and then we'll hear from Monsignor Mennini.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you to Monsignor Antonello Mennini for being here with us. I think that he's the most expert, more than I, so that's what I want to say for the audience before starting my paper. So we start with Cuba, and I would like to start with the fact that, of course, when there was the appeasement, or anyway a beginning of appeasement between the United States and Cuba in mid-December 2014, I think there was much enthusiasm created by these mutual signals. And they were accompanied by public recognition of Pope Francis' measures role in bringing the two historic enemies back to dialogue. This outcome could not have taken shape without some key factors. The first is the continuous presence of the Catholic Church on the ground in the Caribbean island. The second is the Latin American identity of the Pontiff. The third is the need both for the US and the Castro regime to snake out of a difficult situation inherited by a so far outdated Cold War in a brand new global scenario. First of all, we must not forget, this is the first factor, that the Castro dictatorship was the only communist one which never expelled the Papal Nuncius. Papal Nuncius is the equivalent of an ambassador for lay states. That means that the Holy See always had its representative in La Habana, even in the darkest year of the repression against religious institutions and Catholic common citizens. Although persecuted and jailed and shrinking in numbers, priests and nuns continued their job, educating, assisting, and protecting as they could the Cuban people. And the Vatican openly criticized the US embargo as well. It was viewed by Papal Rome not as a way to hit the regime, but as a tool given to the Castros as a comfortable alibi to hide their mistakes and wrongdoings and even crimes in a situation of collapsing economy and a source of pain and further poverty for average Cubans. As an enduring, courageous minority, the Cuban church shaped itself as a popular and rooted community, mainly composed of poor people and intellectuals, seeds of that theology of the people, strongly anti-communist, which the Argentinian Archbishop Jorge Mario Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, had promoted in his own country and in Latin America as a third way between the theology of the liberation influenced by Marxism and right-wing dictatorships. Particularly effective was the Archbishop of Havana, Cardinal Jaime Ortega. Here comes the second factor, the origin of Bergoglio. One of Pope Francis' key aims is spreading freedom of religion and democracy all over the Spanish-speaking Americas and in Brazil. US President Barack Obama welcomed the new opening, saying, "Todos somos americanos, we all are Americans." Francis would say, "We are all Christians," and Cuba is perceived as a part of Christian Latin America. The Pope knows Cuba and its problems very well. He also reaps the fruits of John Paul II and Benedict XVI's strategic work on the issue. He collects the deep knowledge of the situation on the ground through the work made by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, present Vatican Secretary of State, and long-serving apostolic nuncius in Venezuela, a close ally of Cuba, and of Monsignor Giovanni Angelo Becciu, number 2 of the Vatican diplomacy, who was serving as nuncius in Cuba when Benedict XVI visited the island in 2012. But what matters most is the fact that Francis is viewed by the Cuban ailing nomenclatura not as a traditional Westerner, that is, as someone promoting and reflecting the values and interests of the Western world dominated by the United States. The Pope is considered a true mediator, a Latin American thoroughly emancipated from the Cold War's culture and paradigms. With his outspokenness, he has proven to be a natural ally too, but also a severe critic of US strategies on key topics on the global agenda. I met the president of the Argentinian Congress, Julian Dominguez, in last December. He had just met the Pope, and this president told me, while the reconciliation between the US-Cuba had just begun, in Latin America, we say that our Berlin Wall now has fallen down. And in fact, Francis was quoted to have said that if Obama wanted to be loved by Latin Americans, he would solve the problem with Cuba. This is the big picture, Latin America. The Pope is a supporter of La Grande Patria, the big fatherland. He aims at democratizing all the Austral continent and to mend its historic wounds, present and past ones. To get out of a struggle and a divide in the past between military dictators supported by the US and regimes badly influenced by communism. That divide was transferred into the Catholic Church and episcopates, creating fractures and internal struggles which destroyed for a long period the unity of Latin American Catholicism. So Cuba is one more step in the direction of a new primacy of the Church. It's a challenge over the identity of Latin America. The Catholic Church allows a smooth and painless transition in the island and can prove to be a barrier to the US influence and to a business-prone and consumeristic renaissance. The challenge is if Cuba is going to become a new Florida or part of Latin America, led by the teachings of the Argentinian Pope. For Raúl Castro, the choice is mandatory. Better annexed by the Vatican than dominated by the US. When he said in Rome after meeting the Pope last Sunday, "I might turn back to Catholicism," he made the last gesture of realpolitik of an old communist foe who prefers the rules of the Church. To him, Francis is the lesser evil. Better the Vatican protectorate over the Cuban transition to democracy, better social opening and religion against American way of life. The Raúl Castro regime needs to open up because the population is tired, impoverished, and eager to become part of the world at large. Communism has long become an empty shell which nobody fears anymore. The United States, for its part, has an obvious interest to normalize the relations with a long-time adversarial regime in its geopolitical backyard, lest it wanted to risk pushing Cuba and some of its friends in the region into China's economic and strategic orbit, it had to act. Given the fragility of the situation not just in Cuba but also in Venezuela and other countries in the region, it had to act now. Not doing so at this juncture would have been a replay and a caricature of the way in which the United States under John Fitzgerald Kennedy preferred ideology over pragmatism and pushed revolutionary Cuba into the Soviet Union's arms. Furthermore, the continued presence on the Cuban territory of the U.S. Guantanamo base, prison for 9/11 Islamic terrorists, has become a real source of international embarrassment for the United States. Easing the relations with Cuba might help the United States to solve the problem more quickly. Francis, for his history in this culture, is in the very rare positioning which allows him to be a reliable interlocutor in the eyes of leaders who need a kind of alternative West to deal with. This alternative didn't exist before. John Paul II, the Pope, was fundamentally an anti-communist warrior and too firmly positioned in the American camp. And Benedict XVI, the German Pope, perceived that things were changing on that economically failed communist island, but he was overwhelmed by Vatican internal conflicts and forced to focus on them. The global landscape has also shifted significantly. Multipolarism is a matter of fact, no longer just an aspiration, and Francis is an austral pontiff determined to transform the universal Catholic Church as well in a global church, conscious of being a part of a very multifaceted world with limited diversities, different sources of power, and different religions as well. A polyhedron, as he uses to say. In the foreseeable future, so, the Vatican is supposed not to follow the US strategy, even on terrorism against Christian minorities in the Middle East. This Pope doesn't want the Catholic Church and the Vatican to be identified with the traditional West and its wars. Culturally, he seems against the concept itself of a just war. Overall, for the unintended consequences the Western military interventions have provoked in the last years. Francis is an adventurous destroyer of this outdated world. He doesn't recognize the East-West divide. If anything, he may be a Southerner in terms of those world categories. For sure, he's a man without any sympathy for borders and divisions. Under Francis, the Vatican established itself as a balanced international actor in the Syria crisis in September 2013, when it contributed to prevent an armed intervention in the West. He played shrewdly to get Obama and Putin to cooperate on chemical weapons. And the current Vatican does not want a new Cold War to turn into a religious Cold War in Ukraine. That's why Pope Francis' approach to the Ukrainian crisis is cautious and strangely silent. It underlines a divide with the West, but overall, I would say with Europe, not the US, but Europe. As far as we understand, on this issue, Monsignor Mennini is much better informed and he'll give us fundamental tips. Every time the Pope and top officials of the Vatican meet with European leaders, they insist on the need for respecting and not provoking or isolating Russia. They fear a religious Cold War, freezing the attempt for a reconciliation between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And my suspect is that the relations of the Holy See are worse with anti-Russian Ukrainian Orthodoxes than with pro-Russian Orthodoxes. So in looking at Putin as an objective ally in many fields, one can guess a disillusion of the Pope with Europe, a continent he considers not just old, but about to become a kind of spiritual Disneyland, secularized with wonderful churches and cathedrals, but in the long run with empty seminaries and no more faithful. A land of mission, not capable anymore to send missionaries all around the world. The new periphery of the Catholic world, traumatically revealed in March 2013 by the conclave. At the same time, we must add that Francis cannot create peace without a mutual desire of his interlocutors to share similar goals. To move mountains, religion needs the desire of mountains to move. Otherwise, mediation can backfire. What is important is understanding when history calls and be there with the credibility to be a reliable interlocutor. But today, and I finish, much more than 1 year ago, it is important to add that the struggle Francis is fighting in Rome is becoming a dramatic one. The outcome of the conclave was an anti-Italian and anti-European conclave, a victory of the Americas, or in any way, so it was perceived in Rome. And that creates many problems. Francis' international strategy is winning. His relations with the Curia and with a big portion of European episcopates, Italian included, continues to be tormented. Francis is acclaimed by the crowds of the world and by the leaders of the world, not by some of the generals and colonels of his ecclesiastic army. There is the Pope and the people, not always the Church, and that is a problem. Nobody today can predict the final outcome of this growing contradiction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. A lot of fascinating points in there to which we might return, particularly this notion of perhaps Havana seeing the Vatican as a provider of comfort and protection during a period of transition in which American influence might need to be resisted and damned. Your sense of how the Pope is redefining the Vatican into a more global operator, more complex, more flexible, more balanced, and that balance being expressed in things like the balance between Russia and Western Europe, even though Western Europe is seen as religiously hollowing out. And your final point is one I think we should also return to: the Pope and the people and the Vatican establishment. But Monsignor Mennini, over to you, please.
Thank you first of all to Adam to Massimo for asking me to take part in this very interesting conference. Just to give you some frames of the Vatican diplomacy, I would say that the Vatican diplomacy has been always inspired by the mankind's aspiration to seek and to reach a stable and just peace. And then becoming more and more aware of such an important task, Holy See, as Cardinal Casaroli was saying several times, the great Secretary of State of John Paul II, has become along the decades like a companion of the nations on their way through this world, expresses it particularly through her sharing of the concerns, problems, sorrows, and hopes of the peoples. Sharing through initiatives, supporting the positive attempts, contributing positively according to her capacities to overcome the difficulties which are present on the way. To act on the initiatives, in a special way those related to her mission, such as education, culture, health, humanitarian works, along the promotion of the human person. So if we go back to the past centuries, we can recall the heartbroken attempts made, for example, by Pope Benedict XV to put an end to the First World War, defined by him the useless massacre, or the attempts as well of Pope Pius XII to avoid the Second World War, we can retain his famous phrase, "Nothing goes lost with peace, everything can be lost with war." The very important encyclica Pacem in Terris of John 23, and this brave action to overcome the terrible crisis of Russian missiles in Cuba in October 1962, and the formidable address of Pope Paul VI to the United Nations in October 1964, when he cried out, "No more war, no more war," altogether with a prolonged effort to bring all the parties implied in the Vietnam War to the table of negotiation. How could we forget his prophetic perception about the new dimensions of peace when he, with the Encyclica Populorum Progresso in 1967, widened boundaries of the problem of peace, defined that the progress of the so-called third world countries was the new name of peace. Later, we have seen John Paul II to act in order to avoid or to oppose the first war in the Gulf and the second as well. If you allow me, I would like to dare to draw a comparison between Pope John XXIII and Pope Francis. We know that at the time of Cuba crisis, when it seemed that the world would have to fall in the hell of nuclear confrontation, the Russian leader Khrushchev at the last minute pulled out the Russian ships and accepted to negotiate with President Kennedy. But I am convinced, and not only myself, also the historians, that such an outcome was linked to the previous gesture expressed by the Holy Pope to the communist leader, accepting, for example, to meet Alexei Ajubei, the Khrushchev son-in-law, after having accepted in a cordial way the wishes for his birthday sent in by Khrushchev. I think that something very similar has happened in the recent diplomatic developments between Cuba and the United States. In this respect, we have to recall, as Massimo has already said, the visit paid to Cuba by John Paul II in 1998 and the follow-up carried out by Pope Benedict XVI some years ago. But the personal, I think, attitude of Pope Francis, with his appeal in favor of the recall of international sanctions against Cuba, as already did Pope John Paul II for Iraq and later for Iran, has simplified the historic situation. In other words, the Pope, apart from the real problems still disturbing and not in a light way life of Cuban Church, has wanted to demonstrate to the world that the Berlin Wall belongs to the past and how important it is to build up bridges instead of walls. Further, it is known that in the previous months the Holy Father spoke by phone several times to President Raul Castro and to President Obama, underlying the human aspect of the situation, underlying it is the urgency to put an end to the sufferings of Cuban people. In this regard, I would like to remember the great work carried out by His Excellency Archbishop Cesare Zacchi, the nuncio in Cuba, that he became later the president of the Diplomatic Academy of the DC, and then he was my superior, and he was telling us several times that he was able to build up a very positive relation with Fidel Castro when he was meeting him at a reception and other officials meeting, that when he had to ask him something in favor of some person, some prisoner or something, somebody else, he used to give him to put in his pocket a little letter, and Castro never failed to answer in a positive way to his request. So in other words, coming back to the Holy Father, his sympathy, his deep humanity has created an atmosphere of confidence and true openness. We can recall the meeting organized by the Holy Father last June in the Vatican between the Israeli president and the leader of organization of Palestine state. It is in this way that the Holy Father carries out the principles which should inspire the diplomatic action of the Holy See. The first of all, as we know also from his preaching, is that of mercy. This concept is the center of the preaching of Pope Francis and of his political activity as well. Of course, we have not to think that the Holy Father is a naive one, and he does not forget the principle, also theoretical, which have to nourish an effective seek for a durable and just peace. One of these brings the Pope to invite all the nations, as he writes in Evangelii Gaudium, to a generous openness which will prove capable of creating new forms of cultural synthesis. How beautiful are those cities which overcome paralyzing mistrust, integrate those who are different, and make this very integration a new factor of development and peace. This means that each country, each nation, has to save her own political, cultural, and institutional identity. But this can happen only in a new climate which overcomes mistrust, often pushed by ideologies and theoretical approach. And the centrality of mercy, according to the Holy Father, reveals itself as the most suitable instrument to understand the present multipolar political world, our days, no longer divided or dominated by the strong confrontation between West and East by Washington and Moscow, but in which more and more numerous are the capitals playing an important role on the political and economic scene. Let's see now, for example, of Beijing, San Francisco, Sao Paulo, St. Petersburg. It is for this that, not by chance, Pope Francis sings and writes that space is much important than time. Another very meaningful principle which guides the diplomatic activity of the Holy See with Pope Francis is that of solidarity. Always in Evangelii Gaudium, Pope, quoting the great theologian Romano Guardini, writes, "The only measure for properly evaluating age is to ask to what extent it fosters the development and attainment of a full, authentically meaningful human existence in the frame of a sincere solidarity among nations, in accordance with the peculiar character and the capacity of that age." And further, he says, "We must never forget that we are pilgrims journeying alongside one another. This means that we must have sincere trust in our fellow pilgrims, putting aside all suspicion and mistrust, and turn our gaze to what we are all seeking, the radiant peace of God's face." And he said several times that because of this, to build peace is much more difficult than build up hatred and conflict. For what concerns Russia, we can remind the openness how John Paul II outreached his hand to Mr. Gorbachev when he visited the first time and was supporting him with this great idea that unfortunately was not realized, of a common house in Europe from Atlantic Ocean to the Urals Mountains. And that we can remember also his enormous passions, effective help to the Orthodox Church through documents, but specifically with help, for example, giving many scholarships to Russian seminarians, helping the Orthodox Russian Church to found a new, a moral and religious society in Russia. Coming to Ukraine, what really is happening had happened in Ukraine. Of course, a very painful confrontation, like a civil war. But the Odyssey has always thought, was always aware, and many other observers in the world, that Ukraine has been and remains a borderline nation, where the political boundaries do not coincide either with those ethnic or religious boundaries. So the Holy Father knows that the Ukrainians are longing for a desired unity but never reached. And for this, his attitude towards the Ukrainian crisis, while he defended every moment the Ukrainian right to have integrity and independence, for example, he never addressed to the Russian side calling it aggressor. And also, of late, some months ago, he received all the Ukrainian Catholic bishops, both Greek Catholics and Latin Catholic, and unfortunately there the mistrust doesn't exist only between Catholic and Orthodox, also inside the Catholic family. While the Greek Catholics, first of all, were waiting for some words of the Pope in favor of the creation of so-called patriarchate for Greek Catholics in Ukraine, the Holy Father chose another road, asking them, first of all, to reconcile among themselves and to push on the delegation to create a civil society in Ukraine. Then we know that the situation is still very, very, very shaky, very difficult, but we have to appreciate the patience of John Paul or the Pope Francis as John Paul II had. I remember that once I went to, I was invited by John Paul II, all together with the nuncio at the time there in Ukraine, Monsignor, which now is nuncio in Berlin, and he was in a very strong way pushing for the creation of such a patriarchate. Then the Holy Father asked me, what do you think? Most Holy Father, I think that I can imagine, I believe that you would like to make such a step to, of course, to as a sign of reward to Greek Catholics for all they have been suffering in many decades after the repression of Stalin and so on. But also to consider that the Greek Catholic patriarchate question is also a Polish question, because the Western Ukraine, after being under the control of Austro-Hungarian Empire for many decades, has been occupied by Poland, and the Orthodox there, in order to escape the forced Latinization, they prefer to link to Rome. So the Holy Father is also aware that, of course, their faith is out of question and so on. And in the case of the origins of this Greek Catholic Church, there is always a political also motivation. So we have to wait. We have to have the two sides to come to negotiate, but would be very, very disastrous whether the United States would make or continue to make, although secretly, the offering to Ukrainian government to become a member of NATO, because it would be so. We realize very well that Russia is an imperialist state, but the Russia imperialism is no more dangerous than Western imperialism. We have seen what's happened in Iraq after the war, the cancer by Mr. Bush and so on, what is happening now in Syria, what is happening now in Libya. Yes, you could say, you could tell me, but Mr. Gaddafi, Mr. Saddam, they were tyrants, dictators. Yes, it is true, but now how we could put an end to such killing, massacres of Christians or other peoples without help, for example, Russia. And I heard yesterday Mrs. Mogherini who said that to solve the question of the Libyan situation and Middle East, we need also the support of regime. So, what's the future? Can we be optimistic about the evolution of our present world and so on? Yes, of course, we have to understand that the Holy Father is very convinced that Christians has to act according to evangelical criteria, the criteria of evangelical man, of the true disciple of Christ. Of course, I speak as a priest, it's not a triumph which can be historically verified. Rather, it means having the vision to acknowledge the invisible and the confidence that at the end of history all will be judged by God, and we shall be also judged regarding our sincere adhesion to Him beyond any successes or failures in the present world. Indeed, this is an attitude which really matters in our day. The right conscience and the faith that the Lord of histories rewards and leads peoples and individuals toward the road of justice, which does not delude and will never pass away. And just to finish my short address, I would like to remind some words told by Pope John XXIII at the opening of the Vatican Council II, when he was saying, in the everyday exercise our pastoral ministry, greatly to our sorrow, we sometimes have to listen to those who, although consumed with zeal, do not have very much judgment or balance. To them the modern world is nothing but betrayal and ruination. They claim that this age is far worse than previous age. They go on as though they had learned nothing at all from history, and yet history is the great teacher of life. They behave as though the first 5 centuries saw a complete vindication of the Christian idea and the Christian cause, and as though religious liberty was never put in jeopardy in the past. We feel bound to disagree with these prophets of misfortune, in Italian profeti di sventura, who are forever forecasting calamity as though the end of the world were imminent. So I think that it's not a very just to say, well, we have to be optimistic, because as Massimo said, we have to look to these countries emerging with a great sympathy, and also realize that there are good signs of newness inside this, also inside the Saudi Arabia. For example, when the King of Saudi Arabia in 2007 visited Pope Benedict XVI, he told him that from the next day, all Christian, Catholic, Protestant were free to assist to their liturgies and to their faith practice in the hotels, in the house, because it was forbidden up to now. I don't know. Then he told him, I am about to open a university not only for boys but also for girls, and I want you to help me to build up an institutional course of Christianity, to help my people to better understand the Christian world. So we can't yet to observe that every year Saudi Arabia sends out in different countries of the world for further study no less than 10,000 young people every year. And these people can embed, I'm sure that will change the situation.
If I may be less optimistic, just I remember that I was told by Giulio Andreotti that John Paul II met with the Prince of Saudi Arabia and asked him if it were possible to build a church in Saudi Arabia. And the answer was no. So John Paul II tried to forward his proposal, saying, well, but in Rome we have a mosque. The reply was, in Rome, not inside the Vatican.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for what I thought was a very useful overview of the principles, the underlying principles by which the Vatican tries to conduct its diplomacy and the challenges that it sometimes encounters when those underlying principles knock into practical considerations. We've got some time now for discussions. So, first person is Dana Allen at the back.
Thanks. Monsignor Mennini sort of ended on this point, and it's also the Middle East. Reminding us, or I think I remember, based on what he said, that even though Pope John Paul II was actually quite close to some of the more hawkish elements in the United States, he was vehemently opposed to the Iraq invasion, the Iraq war. And Massimo has also written about this. There's a president of the United States now who had more or less exactly the same view of this war, and yet has found himself drawn back into military action in Iraq. So my question is, since this is we're talking about geopolitics here and an alternative Vatican view of how to handle these problems, is there understanding for the reasons why the United States has had to come back into military action in this region?
Why the United States?
I mean, there was strong opposition to what the United States did originally.
We
Is
can
there understanding of what the United States is
I think
now?
that each of us can remind the scene played at the United Nations when Mr. Colin Powell, at the time Secretary of State of Mr. Bush, came with a little bottle showing that this is the proof that Mr. Saddam is in his hands chemical weapons. It was not true at all. I don't remember, but according to what we have read in several books, that the Mr. Bush was also his presidency was strongly supported by all these multinational who make arms and so on. Because the more the world builds up arms, as the Holy Father says, at a certain moment they have to use. And so it was an imperialistic action. There was an illusion that they would have been able to settle down the situation, to bring there the democracy and so on. It is difficult. I see that we are we are still too close to such a great events to express a historic judgment. I don't know. What's your idea?
Well, it was a question, not an idea. But yes, Colin Powell gave evidence at the United Nations Security Council that was based on premises we now know to be untrue. But that was then. Now is now, and there is, the question. The United States has. I mean, part of the burden of your address is, in a certain sense, a different way of looking at these problems and solving these problems. But the United States continuously finds itself using military action in the region. And I'm just, it really is just a question what the Vatican today thinks about that.
we can say that the Holy Father coming back from I don't remember from Philippines, he was asked about the ISIS terrible actions, and the answer to the journalist that the international community should stop the aggressor, only stop, not to destroy him, not to make the situation much worse and so on. But as John Paul II, when addressed the United Nations, he told in a very, very clear way that sometimes we need, at the time that we were still in the nuclear confrontation, also tools of to deter the adversary. It's very difficult to say what is better to do, what is not better to do, but when many innocent people are killed, are destroyed, are burned, and so on, why it is possible not to go, to defend, to save them?
Gentleman in the back row there.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. Why do you think most religions today have become parochial? And as you know, religions by very nature are supposed to be universal. If you are Sunni, you only support the Sunnis. If you are Christian, you only support the Orthodox or the Protestants or the Catholics or Jewish, etc. Or has parochialism become a new trend in foreign policy as we see it today?
As we know better than I, the Holy Father insists very much on the fact that the Catholic Church has to continue the dialogue, interfaith dialogue, also with extremists, Muslim extremists, and so on, not to put away any possible chance to talk with them, and so on. I don't know whether we will succeed in these efforts, but I can tell you, for example, that of late in Iran, the nuncio there with the high authority, Islamic authority there, they have opened a joint, I would say, joint venture in culture, in cultural institute to meet in order to offer to both Catholic, Christian and Muslim a place where to meet, to discuss, to better know each other. For what concerns the divisions among the Orthodox world, this unfortunately we come from very, very far. We are still assisting to a certain conflict, not very open, between Moscow and Constantinople. Because Constantinople pretends to have the leadership of the Orthodox world, while Moscow said the possibility was true some centuries ago, but now that we are the more populated Orthodox nation. But for what concerns the attitude of Catholic Church toward the Orthodox world, I think that we too, as a Catholic Church, we have to recognize our mistakes, our misinterpretation of the past histories. Also, you know that in his book, The Light of the World, Pope Benedict XVI dedicates several pages to his relations to the present Patriarch, at the time Metropolitan Kirill, and to Russia. And he writes, among other things, that unfortunately, also today in Russia, there are many people, Orthodox people, who are fearing, who are scared of Rome. And he continues, because Rome, seen from afar, appears a very strong power, politically, economically, very linked in the past decades to the West strategies and so on. Then I told him, during all the Most Holy Father, the Catholic in Russia Federation today have the task to present to the Orthodox brother another phase of our church. And it's very difficult, you see, because we have also to take in account the psychological and historic divisions between Russia, Poland. The most of our faithful in Russia, they are descendants of Polish old families or German families and so on. So we have to overcome this mistrust. We have to realize that not only because we have to face such a terrible crisis of ISIS, that as the Pope Francis said, all of us, we are pilgrims in the same world. We have the same aim to be reached: peace, trust. I would say also joy, confidence in one another. There is no other way. But in any case, I don't know what concerns the Catholic parishes, parochial. You were saying that possibly you meant that some churches are looking more to the small dimensions, to the great dimensions. In any case, you see, the territorial organization of the church is very effective, because you see people they know each other, they can share the same ideas, they can make important choices for what concerns also the future of the world. For example, here in the UK, here in UK, if we go to visit different dioceses, you always find interfaith group that where Muslim, Jews, Catholic, Anglican, they sit all together. And that sometimes I think if we could transfer such a scene, such a situation, such peaceful dialogue to the Middle East would be the paradise.
Thanks. We've got lots of people wanting to come in a limited amount of time, so we'll take 4 or 5 questions at the same time, and then you can both respond at the end. Is that okay? Yes, you first.
Massimo talked about the Cuban regime preferring a church-led transition to democracy. Obviously, Catholic social teaching provides a model of thought with civic institutions, but in a place like Cuba, what might that church-led transition look like? What might it involve?
Thank you. Gentleman here in the front.
You're talking about the Saudi Arabia situation, but in compared with Iran have in a phase have a church and a representative in a parliament. But in the situation that during the open door, the ranking that Iran is in the 7th position, and at least 75 Christian in a prison right now. In Iran, but what's going to have an official meeting with Iranian government? Is it any dialogue for real or free this prisoner or that?
Thank you, gentleman in the second row here.
Raul Castro was in the Vatican last week, and he said how impressed he was with Pope Francis, and he said, I might even become a Catholic. I wonder, however, whether we're not being cautious enough with Cuba. Beta Soler, who leads the Ladies in White group that's been protesting for 12 years now over political prisoners, she said that she thought this statement from Castro made in the Vatican was a joke. She said that she thought he was mocking the Holy Father, and that he'll never be a Christian. And she wondered why, if this is the case, I don't know, she wondered why Pope Francis didn't raise the question of political prisoners in Cuba. I don't know whether he did, but she thought that he did.
Thank you. Yes, you, sir?
Hi. You didn't mention about the Asian situations. There are many Catholic in Asia as well. But as for look at China and South Korea and Japan, it's still 70 years after the war. It's a kind of antagonistic. The war of wars is continuing. And what kind of policy you have in Asian front, let's say.
And then the gentleman sitting behind you. I'm going to summarize these questions at the end. Don't worry.
Sorry. From time to time, I feel that the Vatican has a particular brand of magic in terms of diplomacy and mediation. And my question is, in terms of size, Vatican is a very small country, but how do you gather necessary information, diplomatic information, in order for Vatican to play a prominent role in mediation?
Nomi Bayako.
Excuse
Thank
me.
you.
We didn't
I
understand.
will summarize.
Okay.
Thank you, Adam. My question follows directly from the gentleman in front of me. It's about Massimo mentioned specifically the mediation and the mediation carried out between Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama ahead of the Syrian deal, and I was wondering how much mediation basically is a feature in the Vatican, how it's done, whether the V8 is part of sort of a mediation, whether they have the mediation role or whether there's another mediation unit. How do they decide in the Vatican which international conflicts they are going to mediate? Do they wait to be invited, or do they have a list of their own criteria? What is the mechanism as such, and the rationale for taking such a large international mediation role?
Okay, I think we'll need to draw a line there, with apologies to other people. So the questions, as I understood them, were what would, in the case of Cuba, a church-led transition look like in practical terms? On Cuba, there was also the point about whether there were risks entailed for the Vatican and perhaps overextending itself in the direction of a Cuba that it was suggested might not be entirely sincere. There was a question about dialogue with Iran. There was a question about the place of Asia in the Vatican's diplomacy. And then the two questions about the practical aspects of Vatican diplomacy. One, which you perhaps didn't hear fully, was about how the Vatican gathers its information and its intelligence. And then the point that we just heard, on what basis does the Vatican decide where it wishes to intervene in order to mediate particular disputes? Does it insert itself? Does it wait for invitation? So, Massimo, do you want to perhaps kick off, and then we'll give the Monsignor the final
Yes,
word?
very quickly. About the transition in Cuba, my suspect is that Raúl Castro thinks of the mediation of the church as a tool for the survival of the Castros and of the communist nomenclatura. I think this is not very likely, but I understand that they tend to mix their survival with a painless transition. So I think that the church can have a role granting not a painful transition. So in a way they can grant the nomenclatura survival not as a nomenclatura but as people living. No vengeance, no such thing. Second, I think that culturally the church can play a big role in granting the preservation of Cuban identity, not as a communist country, but as an old Christian country in which roots remained all over the years, notwithstanding the communist regime. This is the first thing. About the mediation of the church, it's very interesting. Monsignor Mennini didn't talk that much about Ukraine, but he said two things which to me look fundamental. He said the Vatican never called Putin an aggressor. This is a key point. Second, he said that in Ukraine there is a civil war. This is already an answer to mediation. This means, for instance, that the church tends not to marry one of the two fronts. And in general, I think that the church is invited. For instance, it's not very common, but in Venezuela, after the death of Chavez, the church was called to be a mediator through Cardinal Parolin. But the church, as far as I know, refused this role because there were no guarantees enough that this mediation might succeed. So in general, I think that the fact that the Church has a network of people on the ground is the key factor which grants the Church to know the situation from inside. So it's not important if it's invited or it invites itself. The problem is that they know that the Church usually knows. The problem is reconciling the interests of the Church with the interests of the actors on the ground.
Do you want to pick up on any of the other points as well?
Pardon?
Do you want to pick up on any of the other points on Iran or Asia?
Very briefly, I think that Asia is still the black hole of the Vatican, because there Christians are growing in number, they are very strong and courageous, but I think that there is a problem, and the big problem overall is China. In China, the Vatican is not a priority. Usually in China, the Vatican is used for internal maneuvers of the Communist Party. So, I don't know, as far as I know, there is some step forward, but I'm not so prepared to answer your question. Sorry about that.
For what concerns the situation in China, possibly we know that thanks to Lady Thatcher, the Holy See is present in Hong Kong, because the 1 year before Hong Kong went back to under the jurisdiction of China, Lady Thatcher signed an agreement with the Holy See, according to which a diplomat of the Holy See could permanently reside in Hong Kong. And later the Chinese government has accepted such an agreement. But just to give to recall what Massimo was saying, and to give you also the atmosphere which still exists, this Vatican diplomat, now there too, the office is quite large, is still present in Annuario Pontificio. Is a cultural attaché to the Nansha in Philippines. Però I can tell you that since some years, all the bishops, either belonging to the Patriotic Church, either belonging to the Church Faithful to Rome, are appointed with approval of the Holy Father. So we are making some steps forward, and then we'll see what will happen. I remember when I was in Russia, people of the Ministry of the Foreign Office was telling me when we were talking about, Monsignor, the Holy See has to give the Chinese government some more or less 8-9 years, because as Massimo was saying, what do they represent for them? 12, 15, 20 millions of Catholics and so on. So they had to take over the situation, and later they will open the doors and so on. We opened like this. Because according to recent studies, China could be in the next decades the most Christian countries of the world. Not Catholic, possibly Protestants, Pentecostalists, and so on. So then, coming back to Iran, we know very well the situation because I'm in touch with an organization here working for priests, a Christian arrested in Iran. Of later I sent some document to Monsignor Gallagher, and he told me that he would have forward to the nuncio there in Tehran. I don't know whether the Holy Father has not raised the question. You know very well that John Paul II visited Cuba in 1998. The next year, Fidel Castro sentenced to death no less than 30 opponents. And the Holy Father, the poor one, made whatever he could. He sent to him a personal letter, he sent the nuncio, but he didn't accept it. We know that we had to run this. for what concerns other mediation, I can tell you that for peaceful development of the very dangerous crisis in South Africa, at the time the South Africa government asked the OLC to mediate with the African National Congress, and the action of the OLC brought to the liberation of Mr. Mandela. It was recognized not on video, but it was recognized, for example, specifically, if you go back to the archives, by the most important magazine, French magazine Le Monde. It was written.
So you think that this kind of happy outcome is more likely? Or?
Yes, it depends. You see, the OLC can play a role when she is asked how to do something, you see, but it can't interfere, also according to the Lateran Treaty. Otherwise,
I feel we've only really scratched the surface of this, so I hope you'll both agree to come back another time and we can continue the conversation then. But in the meantime, Monsignor, Massimo, thank you both very much.
Thank you.